So I know it's been a long break, but the truth is we're in the middle of a Mishnah.
Yes, I was thinking about that last night.
We're in the middle of a Mishnah.
Yeah.
So we're in chapter 4, Pirkei Avos, Mishnah 20, Mishnah Chov. Attributed, well, it's actually a Mishnah in two parts, okay? So the first part of the Mishnah was attributed to Elisha ben Avuya, and we haven't finished that part. And then the second part of the Mishnah is attributed to Rabbi Meir, who was his student. And there are even versions that put in a third rabbi into the Mishnah as well, but because that's not the common version, we're just going to pretend it's not there for now. Okay, so what does Elisha ben Avuya say? Two things. First, he tells us about when you learn and the impact of learning when a person is young versus learning when a person is older. And then he speaks about the difference between who you learn from. Learning from a person who is young versus learning from a person who is old. So those are the two things that Elisha ben Avuya teaches. And then Rabbi Meir comes along. This is the part of the Mishnah we haven't even begun at all. And Rabbi Meir says what's pretty well known. Al tistakel bakankan. What does that mean? Don't look at what's the kankan? A vessel, right? It's a very generic translation. So what's a kankan? It's like a canister, a jug, something along those lines, right? A kad is usually a jug. So we're going to look at why he chooses to use that word. But rather you should look at the contents. Don't look at the container, look at the contents. Okay, why? What does he say? Because yesh kan. What does he say? Yesh kan chodosh, right? Sometimes you get a new vessel. And what does it have inside it? Content that is old. And then he says something interesting. Then you have a kan yoshan shafil chodosh ein boy. Sometimes you have an old vessel that doesn't even have new contents inside it. It's also very interesting the way that he words it. Okay, so let's review first the part about Elisha ben Avuya and the context and who he is and how that's significant to what he says. So Elisha ben Avuya is of the opinion that it's always best to learn Torah when you are young. And we had a whole conversation around this. We said, what does that mean? In today's world, we call this ageism. Right? It's a discriminatory position. What do you mean? When you're young, that's when you should learn. And that's when you're like this fresh parchment. And when you're old, that's when it's like an erased parchment, like a messy surface. You know, you're trying to write on a messy surface. What's he actually telling us? So we looked at a few different perspectives, but we haven't really finished it. So let's look at a couple other perspectives. And one of them is historical. Now, Elisha ben Avuya, remember, was one of 4 rabbis who delved into all kinds of mystical experiences, and for 3 of them it wasn't a very healthy thing. So we know that there was Ben Azai and Ben Zoyma, and Ben Azai passed away, and Ben Zoyma lost his mind, and Rabbi Akiva was the one, nichnas b'shalom v'yotze b'shalom, everything was fine. What happened with Elisha ben Avuya? So we're told that Elisha ben Avuya went off the rails. He went off the derech, as we like to say in today's world, right? He went off the derech. But the way that the Gemara describes it is very interesting. It says, kitseitz binetios, which is very euphemistic. It basically means that he dug at the roots, or the netios are the new saplings. So it almost means like he, instead of saying that he chucked out his Judaism, it says that he messed around with the saplings of Jewish life. Okay, now we have to understand what that means, besides just being a euphemism. So this is the story. Elisha ben Avuya, when he went through his crisis and he had his break with his Jewish heritage, he used to frequently go to schools. And he used to see the young children as they were learning Torah. And he used to make fun of it in front of the kids. Now just picture the scene for a second. Here's a person who walks in who looks like a rabbi, looks like a venerable sage, comes into the very impressionable first grade class, and he sees the children learning Torah, then he starts saying, what are you wasting your time for? Why are you learning Torah? You should rather go off and get a trade. It would be the equivalent of today's world, go get a degree. So he'd say, go get a trade, go become a carpenter, go become a shoemaker, make something of your life. And the children were very impressionable, and many kids, when they heard this, that was the beginning of the end of their studies. And at some point, they abandoned their Torah learning and they went off and they studied a trade or whatever the case is. Now, all through Elisha ben Avuya's journey of heresy, he had a tag-along called his ex-student Rabbi Meir, and that's why they land up being in the Mishnah together. And Rabbi Meir used to tag along wherever he went. And he would consistently, firstly, he would pick his brain, because Elisha ben Avuya had this immense knowledge of Torah. And secondly, he would badger him all the time to do teshuvah. And Elisha ben Avuya would always dismiss Rabbi Meir, and he'd say, it's not possible. I'm too far gone. I've even had insight that in heaven they say everybody could do teshuvah except Acher. Remember, that's what they called him, Acher. Everybody else has access except for me. But when Elisha ben Avuya was older, as is often the case, when a person reaches that stage of life where they start to feel a little bit frail and they start to feel that life is drawing to an end, very often people reconsider. And Elisha ben Avuya at that point realized that perhaps he couldn't do teshuvah in his mind, in his self-assessment. He felt that he couldn't do teshuvah, but he had to contribute something. He had to do something to correct his ways. And what played on his mind the most, and what he felt the most guilty about, was all of these children who, because of his influence, had abandoned their Torah studies. And so because of that, he taught this principle: learn Torah when you're young, to compensate for the fact that he had discouraged young people from learning Torah. So this is, in a sense, this Mishnah captures a big part of his teshuvah, encouraging children to learn Torah when they're young. Now, the young, again, we get very uncomfortable with this, because usually by the time most people learn this Mishnah, it's kind of too late. This whole Mishnah is about learning when you're young, but very few people learn it when they're young. So what is it supposed to mean to us? There's a very interesting line from Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, where he talks about the Nar Koton, the young child, umisken. How do you say misken? How do you translate misken in English? Right? In South Africa, it's shame. Right? What's misken? It's like a nebuch, somebody who's weak, who doesn't necessarily have abilities or confidence. And then he speaks about the Melech Zokein Uchsil, the king who is old and foolish. And in doing so, Shlomo HaMelech is effectively describing the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Tov is considered young. Why is the Yetzer Tov young? Why is the Yetzer Tov young? Because it only enters into our consciousness later on in life. Whereas the Yetzer Hara is already old, it's already been around, right? The Yetzer Hara is there from birth. And the Yetzer Tov only really kicks in when a person reaches the age of maturity in Judaism. So, Bar Bas Mitzvah, that's the big Bar Bas Mitzvah present. It's not the Parker pens or whatever it is. It's the fact that you get your Yetzer Tov to be fully functional. So therefore it's considered young. Now the motivation of the Yetzer Tov versus the motivation of the Yetzer Hara are obviously very different. Obviously, right? So if I had to ask you, what is the motivation of the Yetzer Tov? You would say, to get us to get closer to Hashem, which should mean that the Yetzer Tov is always going to encourage us that we should do mitzvahs and we should learn Torah. Okay, that's easy. What is the motivation of the Yetzer Hara? The opposite, right? The opposite. In the book of Tanya, the first 8 chapters of the book of Tanya build this whole insight into how it is that the two forces within us work. What's called the godly soul and the animal soul, which then play out through the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. In chapter 9, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the author of Tanya, speaks about the concept of the battleground, that the human being is the battleground. The entire chapter 9 is focused on what the Yetzer Tov wants, otherwise known as the Nefesh Elokis, the divine soul, what the divine soul wants. The last line of chapter 9 says, and the animal soul / the Yetzer Hara, Ritzoina lehefech mamash. Its will is the exact opposite of the Yetzer Tov. In other words, it doesn't have ambition, it doesn't have goals, it doesn't have a particular program that it wants to achieve. All it wishes is for the opposite of the Yetzer Tov. That's what it wants. So now, What's the biggest problem that the Yetzer Hara has? You know what the biggest problem? You think it's easy to be a Yetzer Hara, right? Because I mean, it's easy to fall for the Yetzer Hara. It's not so easy to be a Yetzer Hara. Why not? Because at the end of the day, we are wired to do what Hashem wants. That is our reality. We're wired to do what Hashem wants. There's a very famous halacha of the Rambam in the laws of divorce, where the Rambam says this. It's such a fascinating halacha. The Rambam says, what happens if there is a scenario where, according to Jewish law, a man is required to divorce his wife? Okay? So now what do? He is required by halacha to divorce his wife. There's only one problem. He doesn't want to. And the Torah says clearly that divorce has to be with his consent. But he doesn't want to. So what do? We make him want to, says the Rambam. That's what the Rambam says. And it's not the Rambam's invention. It's from the Gemara in Gittin that says, Koifin oisoi, you force him until he says, I want to. Which sounds very much like how life was under communism, right? You got forced to say you wanted certain things. Now, surely the Rambam asks, this is a complete waste of time and energy. You can't force somebody until they say they want to, and then imagine that it's consensual. That's not consent. So the Rambam asked, how does this work? How do you force a person to do something and then call it consensual? And what he says is fascinating. This is the Rambam, and I'm emphasizing that because it's not some book of philosophy. It's not the Moira HaNevuchim where the Rambam writes about philosophy. It's not some midrash which may or may not be literal. This is Mishnah Torah. This is where the Rambam codifies Jewish law. That means whatever he says over here is not only literal, but it is legally binding. That's how clear this teaching is. So the Rambam says that the reason that it is acceptable that you can force a person until such time as they say, I want to do X, says the Rambam, is because the ratzon, the will of every Jewish person, is to do every mitzvah and to avoid every aveira. Why is this person refusing to give a get? Says the Rambam, quote, Ela sheyitzroi hu she'onsoi. It's just that his Yetzer Hara has misled him or overwhelmed him and got him into the wrong way of thinking. So with a little pressure in the other direction, we reset the balance and take the person back to the state of wanting to do what Hashem wants. So you think it's easy to be a Yetzer Hara? It's not so easy. We're wired to do what Hashem wants. So therefore the Gemara says very famously, how does the Yetzer Hara work? Kach hi darka shel Yetzer Hara. This is the approach of the Yetzer Hara. What's the approach of the Yetzer Hara? Anybody remember? How does the Yetzer Hara work? Hayoim oimer loi asei kach. Today the Yetzer Hara says do X. And tomorrow the Yetzer Hara proposes that we do Y. Until eventually the Yetzer Hara gets us to listen enough that we could, God forbid, serve idolatry. So now let's work this out. Why does the Gemara say Hayoim oimer loi asei kach? That on day one the Yetzer Hara says do such. Really what the Gemara should have said is, on day one the Yetzer Hara says, Avor kach. Do this transgression. Asei kach sounds like the Yetzer Hara is telling us to do something that is valid, that is worth doing. Why would the Yetzer Hara start off by telling us to do what's worth doing, what's right to do? Why? Because otherwise we're not going to listen. If the Yetzer Hara were to arrive and say, speak Lashon Hara, we would never do it. So what does the Yetzer Hara say? Say something good about the person. Right? Share something good about it. And then while you're about it, just make sure that you cover that area that people need to know about. That's how the Yetzer Hara works. How does the Yetzer Hara work? Does the Yetzer Hara arrive and tell somebody, don't daven with a minyan? We never say don't daven with a minyan. What does the Yetzer Hara say? Learn some Gemara at the time the minyan's davening. That's how the Yetzer Hara, asei kach. The Yetzer Hara will always start with a proposal that is, at least superficially, mandated by Torah. And then once the Yetzer Hara's got our ear, then the Yetzer Hara says, maybe try this, maybe try that. So what's the fundamental difference between the Na'ar Katan Miskein and the Melech Zaken Uchsil, the youngster, the Yetzer Tov, and the old so-called king, the Yetzer Hara? What's the difference? There's only one difference between them. Only one difference. The Yetzer Tov will tell you, Asay kach, do the correct thing for the correct reasons. What we call lishma. Why would the Yetzer Tov tell us to do a mitzvah? For Hashem's sake. Whereas the Yetzer Hara always tells us to do even the right things, but for an ulterior motive. Do the mitzvah so that you'll get this value, so that you'll be recognized in the community, so that you'll have whatever bracha in your life, etc. That's the starting point of the Yetzer Hara. So therefore, when Elisha ben Avuya tells us, now think how profound this is coming from who it comes from. When he tells us that a person should always learn Torah as a youngster, because that will be like writing on fresh parchment. And don't say it, don't learn it as an old person, because that's like writing on a scruffy surface. What's he really saying? Always learn Torah with the motivation of the Yetzer Tov, with the motivation of Lishma. Why do I learn Torah? Because that's what Hashem wants. And not from the perspective of being a Zaken, which is why do I learn Torah? Because, as the Gemara famously says, that you should not learn Torah in order to be called a scholar, or in order to be paid for your Torah learning, and so on and so forth. So shaloi lishma, right? For the wrong reasons. I don't know if I ever told you the story before, but to me it's one of the most fascinating stories. Is the story happened sometime in Russia, and there were these two Hasidim who were friends of each other. And the one walks into a shul, and he sees his friend sitting with a sefer that he had found in the Geniza, in the Shemus. Did I ever tell you the story before? In the Shemus. So you know what that is. Where, any sefer or anything of holiness that can no longer be used, you don't discard it. So you put it, you put it in those days in an attic. Now we have a space in the cemetery where we bury it. So this fellow had found the sefer in the Geniza that was completely ripped right down the middle. So, in other words, not one page was whole. Not one sentence was complete. And he sees his friend sitting there, studying the Sefer like it was the most profound book he had ever learned. He comes up and says, how could you learn it? It's not possible. It's not physically possible to learn this book. Because every single sentence is only half a sentence. So nothing makes sense. How could you read this book? So you know what he said to him? He said, this is the one time in my life that I can be 100% guaranteed that I'm studying Lishma. I'm studying for Hashem's sake, because I will get zero benefit out of this. There's nothing. I can't walk out of here understanding one line of what I've read. So the only reason to be learning must be because it's for Hashem's sake. So I'm pleased to be able to learn Lishma. Okay? It's quite an insight, right? It's one of these things that they say, don't try this at home. Or maybe we should try it at home. So that's the message over here, that a person should study like a child with that wonder, that acceptance, that lishma of the child / the Yetzer Tov, rather than with the self-invested interests of an adult or the Melech Zaken Uksil, the Yetzer Hara. And then what does he say? He says, Haloi me Torah minas keinim. If a person, by the way, some versions of the Mishnah do include the word Torah and some don't. Right? So that's why, if you remember, when we first did this Mishnah, there's a debate whether he's telling us if you're learning from an advanced scholar or you're teaching people who are adult. So what does he say? If a person learns Torah from people who are older, more mature, what's that compared to? So that's compared to somebody who drinks yayin yashan, old wine, aged wine, and eats ripe grapes. Whereas the person who learns Torah from a young person, that's like eating grapes that are not yet fully formed. And shoyse yayin migitoi, which I don't think we necessarily know exactly what that is because we're not in the wine production. Maybe you make wine for Pesach, I don't know. But the average person is not necessarily involved in the wine production, so it's wine that hasn't fermented properly. So it's kind of like grape juice, but it's somewhere in between grape juice and wine, and it's not particularly enjoyable to drink. Now, quite a number of the Meforshim point out that what happens when you drink this yain migitoi, this unfermented wine or this so-called immature wine, is it's actually very sweet. And then an hour or so later, you feel sick as anything. And he says that's actually what happens when a person learns from a teacher who is not a qualified teacher. Young doesn't necessarily mean in years. Young could just mean simply they're not qualified. They don't have the depth of experience that they should have. So when you learn from such a person initially, it's wow, amazing. But subsequently, it gives you a stomach ache, or in this case, a headache, because you realize that the information isn't well presented, or there are gaps in the information, or simply they miss the point. Right? Sometimes they just simply miss the point. It's one of the things. I don't think it's as much of a trend now as it was, but seeing as we're talking about Elisha ben Avuya, who went through that whole spiritual experience, it's quite relevant. There was a time, do you remember when Kabbalah was very trendy? Remember, it was very trendy to learn Kabbalah. It's kind of moved like any other fad. It's kind of moved on. Today you don't hear about Kabbalah. The big religion of the world today is gender fluidity. But in those days, in the good old days, it was Kabbalah, right? So that's where you saw this. You saw people who were young, meaning to say they were inexperienced. It was extremely attractive when they would run these Kabbalah seminars. People would flock from all over the place to experience these seminars and discover all kinds of weird and wonderful things about themselves. But in the long term, what happened is everybody was left with some kind of a spiritual stomachache, because you don't really get the depth, you don't really get the insight, and so as a result, the person doesn't really have the basis, the foundation that they need in order to learn properly. Let's move to Rabbi Meir and his kankan, shall we? And it's not a Latin American kankan. This one, this is a Hebrew kankan. Okay, so what happens with Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir tells us, Al tistakel b'kankan, don't look at the vessel, and b'masha yesh boy, look at what is inside it. Now, with the context of everything that we have learned so far about this Mishnah and the people in the Mishnah, what do you think Rabbi Meir was telling us? Just at face value, from an historical, biographical perspective, what do you think Rabbi Meir's message is, in context of this Mishnah? Exactly. Rabbi Meir was criticized by some of his colleagues for the fact that he maintained a relationship and continued to study from Elisha ben Avuya. Said, how can you do this? This man is a heretic. This man should be excommunicated. You should have nothing to do with him. Why Rabbi Meir? And it's a consistent thing. It wasn't a once-off. Rabbi Meir consistently follows Elisha ben Avuya around through his life and continues to learn from him. And people were critical of that. Like, why are you learning from such a person? Says Rabbi Meir, Al tistakel b'kankan. Don't look at the external. You're absolutely right. Externally, meaning to say, as far as the eye can see, as far as we can experience in our lives, this is somebody who is no longer a model of what a rabbi should be or a Jewish person should be. That's true. But Masha Yesh boy, sometimes you have kankan yoshon, sometimes you have an old vessel, as he was, old meaning to say almost like stained and abused, but he still had chodosh within him. He still had new insights that he consistently was able to share because of his immense knowledge. And so that's why the statement eventually that the Gemara made to vindicate Rabbi Meir is, they say Rabbi Meir rimoin motza. It's a very interesting metaphoric, poetic way that the Gemara says it. It says Rabbi Meir found a pomegranate. What did he do? Toichoi ochal. He ate the inside of the pomegranate, kliposai zorak, and he discarded the hard peel on the outside. As anybody else would eat a pomegranate, what do you think Rabbi Meir was the only person who ever ate a pomegranate like that? Everybody eats the pomegranate like that. What's the message? He engaged with Elisha ben Avuya in such a way that he was able to get oichel, that which was, or toichoi, that which was within, that which was deeper, that which was, Rabbi Meir could be discerning enough to be able to distinguish between what was valid insight and information and worth keeping and what needed to be discarded. Now, not all of us know how to do that, and so not everyone can do a Rabbi Meir move on a person like an Elisha ben Avuya personality. But it's a fascinating insight. So Rabbi Meir is not just sharing a theoretical concept over here, he's sharing his own experience. So over Shabbos, somebody made an interesting comment to me, well, a comment at our Shabbos table that got a very interesting conversation going with our children. The comment was this: usually when you first meet a person, it's like the first time that you see a beautiful tree. When you first meet a person, it's always that way. When you first meet a person, what a lovely person. You come home, I just met somebody, they're such a nice, but they're so friendly, they're so this or whatever. Then you get to know them. What happens when you get to know them? So when you get to know a person, it's kind of like looking at the part of the tree that's beneath the surface, the roots network of the tree, which is not so beautiful anymore, right? And the earth that the tree sits in. It's not so once you get to know a person and you kind of dig a little bit more into their life, you discover maybe they're not so angelic, maybe they're not so perfect. And unfortunately, very often in a relationship, that's kind of where it ends. And then, if you choose to look even deeper, you discover that beyond the tree and beyond the roots, there's a whole world under that ground that contains minerals and gems and water and all kinds of beauty, but you have to really look deeply enough to find it in the person. So it started a whole conversation at our table when my kids said, why do you have to dig at all? Why don't you just look at the tree and be happy with the tree? But the truth is, because it's human nature to deepen a relationship, and it's human nature to learn more about people. And the challenge is not to stop when we get to the mud, but to keep looking until we find the hidden treasures. So that's what Rabbi Meir is telling us over here. Al tistakel b'kankan. We should never satisfy ourselves by looking at a person just in terms of what meets the eye. And that's not physical appearance. It's everything about the person that meets the eye. We have to look deeper until we find that which is deep, deep within them. And if we don't find the good within the person, we haven't looked deeply enough. And that's the point. Because if we're just looking at the superficial, we'll find that there's old vessels, meaning to say people who appear to be wise, and we don't see the wisdom. Or we could see young people, and we feel, they're young, they don't know anything, and we could dismiss them. That's the simplest understanding of what Rabbi Meir is telling us over here, and I think everybody knows this, right? It's a very well-known Mishnah, and it's one of the things that we try and remind ourselves all the time. Don't judge, as we say in the English cliche, the book by its cover. Okay. But there's something really profound that lies inside this statement of Rabbi Meir. So let's have a look. In the 13 attributes of mercy, the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, there's a statement that doesn't seem to fit. Now, let's just put it into context, right? We've just come from the Shivasa B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, when we read the parasha that speaks about the 13 attributes of mercy. And then at Mincha on Tisha B'Av, we're going to read it again. So when did this all happen? When did we learn, we, the Jewish people, or Moshe Rabbeinu, our leader, when did we learn about the 13 attributes of Hashem's mercy? After the Chet HaEgel. What's the Chet HaEgel? Al tistakel b'kankan. What's the Chet HaEgel? A whole bunch of Jews standing at the foot of Mount Sinai after the single most profound divine event ever in history, never to be repeated. And what are they doing? They're gyrating around some oversized, well, we actually don't know, it could have been small, golden calf. Right? In all the artwork, the golden calf is massive. We don't know, maybe it was a little golden calf. How do you know? And everybody's like doing their shtick around over there, you know. And Hashem says, Zehu, that's it. These people have breached the most important part of our relationship, the first of the 10 commandments. I'm going to destroy them all. And Moshe says, whoa, hang on a second. Surely we can work a way around this. And then Hashem allows Moshe to so-called remind him of the 13 attributes of mercy. Hashem, Keil, Racham, V'chanan, and it's a beautiful moment, and thank God, and we're all forgiven, and everything is well, and we're given a gift called Yom Kippur for the rest of history, so we can always, in any emergency, find a way back home, and you can always invoke the 13 attributes, because that's what Hashem tells Moshe, that anytime you need mercy, you say these words, and everything's going to be great, right? Tell me if I left anything out. Yes? We're happy with this, yes? We're happy that that's what it is. The 13 attributes of mercy is like this free pass. Get out of jail. Whatever we need, we can always return to Hashem, and there's a way back. Now, what does it say? So when you listen to the Torah reading on a fast day, that section, which is the 13 attributes, has a different tune, a different cantillation, different trop. We use the Rosh Hashanah tune for that part of the reading. And then the next pasuk, we go back to the regular reading. What's the next pasuk? Then not a paragraph later, not a portion later. The next line in the Torah is what? V'nakeh lo yenakeh, which is that there are certain times that Hashem won't cleanse. Well, hang on a second. You just told me. You just told me the 13 attributes of mercy, open door policy, get out of jail free, all these wonderful things. And the next line says, V'nakeh lo yenakeh, that Hashem's not going to cleanse. And immediately all the commentaries point out, and I think Rashi brings it there as well, if I'm not mistaken, V'nakeh, that Hashem will cleanse lashavim, for people to do teshuvah, lo yenakeh, and Hashem will not cleanse those that don't do teshuvah. Okay, so let's put these words on the board, right? So we've got I'm sure it worked a second ago, eh? Let's try that again. V'nakeh. Okay? Loi yenakeh. Can you see that? Right? V'nakeh, loi yenakeh. You can't see it, right? It's like useless. Let's just see if there's another color that works. Okay, 1 second. Let's see if we can get a color that actually stands out, because it would be valuable to see this. There we go. Can you see that? It's v'nakeh, sorry, v'nakeh, loi yenakeh. Okay, so that means that he's not going to cleanse, right? That there's a possibility that if a person doesn't necessarily do teshuvah as they should, then they don't get cleansed. Okay? Now, let's play anagrams over here. What word can you see in here? Kan. Kan is in there. Kan is in those words. Right? Yenakeh has a nun and a kuf, and v'nakeh and yenakeh both have a nun and a kuf. That's kan. If I'm loy, what does Rabbi Meir say? Al tistakel b'kan. Don't look at the kan. Don't get caught up in the part of the parsha that seems to say that Hashem may not forgive us. Look at what's inside. In other words, the deeper meaning of these words. So if I take away the kan, right? Let's remove the kan from it. What am I left with? Hashem's name. Yud Kei Vav Kei. I'm left with Hashem's name. Why is that relevant to us? Because how do the 13 attributes of mercy begin? Hashem, Kel Racham V'chan, right? That's how it begins. This is the name of Hashem's mercy, of Hashem's compassion. So Rabbi Meir says, when you look at that person as he had done with Elisha ben Avuya, and it looks like this is a person, nakeh lo yenakeh. This is a person who can't be cleansed. There's no way home for them. So he says, Al tistakel b'kan. It's not my job to look at that part of them that can't be forgiven, that can't be fixed. That's not my job. Hashem could look at that. I have to look, Al tistakel b'kan. Don't look at the kan. Rather see the whatever else is in that story, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Now, at this point in time, you may very well be thinking, okay, it's a nice word, it sounds sweet, but at the end of the day, what is the connection between saying the Ma and Hashem's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei? Like, well, what on earth is the connection between them? So to understand that, we're going to look at an amazing but somewhat mystical insight from the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai was a great Sephardi mystic and scholar. He wrote amazing interpretations on the various parts of the Gemara called the Ben Yehoyada, and on the Pirkei Avos called Zechus Avos. So look what he says. Very interesting. Okay, now you've got to, as they say in the classics, you've got to fasten your seatbelts a little bit for this. Okay, so the Ben Ish Chai says as follows. What is a kankan? A kankan is a container. It's actually quite a generic word for a container, because usually when you talk about wine, remember this is the Mishnah, in everywhere else in the Mishnah, when we talk about wine containers, we usually talk about kadei yayin. A kad is like a jar or a jug of wine. That's usually what we refer to. Or alternatively, you might want to talk about a bakbuk, even though it's not very common in Mishnah language, but that would be a bottle. Or you might want to talk about the barrels, the chaviyos, the original barrels that would be in the winery. But a kankan is not a specific wine container, it's a generic container. So the Ben Ish Chai says, we have to understand what is the generic container of divine energy that runs our world. Okay? Or to put it slightly differently, we know that Hashem manifests in many different ways, represented by many different names. Which is the name of Hashem, because that will help us, which is the name of Hashem that represents Hashem's mastery over creation, mastery over the world? Which name of Hashem would that be? Not Elokim. Elokim would be the name of Hashem that represents Hashem's either din, that means to say the system that Hashem uses that cannot be negotiated in running the world, or Elokim represents how Hashem withholds himself so that he's not visible in the world. But that's not the name of Hashem that represents his mastery over existence. So which name? Right? And Adoin is a master. So when we use the name Adnai, so I'm not pronouncing it properly obviously, when we use Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, that's to express Hashem's mastery over the world. That's why when we say a bracha, what do we say? Baruch Atah Hashem. So Hashem is the highest name of godliness. Yud Kei Vav Kei is the highest name of godliness. So what do we say? Elokeinu, personal, our God, right? But we pronounce it Baruch Atah Adnai, because what we want to say is, you're the master of the world, Melech HaOlam, as we're about to say a moment later, right? The king of the world. So therefore, says the Ben Ish Chai, the kankan, the container of divine energy that runs the world, is represented by the name of Hashem, Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud. That's the experience, if you wish, of divine intervention or interaction with our world. So how much godliness do we get to experience living here? And when I say here, not on earth, in the entire created reality, as much as Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, Adnai, the kankan will share with us. Now, is it fair to say, or is it correct to say, that Hashem is great because he is the master of the universe? Is that correct to say? And if you feel it's a trick question, it might be. So, is that fair to say, that Hashem is great because he is master of the universe?
Great. He's the master of the universe because he's great.
Okay, so let's just say that in slightly different words. Master of the universe is incredibly impressive to those of us who are citizens of the universe. So to us it's a big deal to be the master of the universe. For infinite God, to be master of the universe is a joke. It's nothing. So it's actually almost like an insult if we were to say Hashem's greatness is that he's master of the universe. No, Hashem is infinite. Therefore, if there's a need to be master of the universe, he'll be master of the universe. Right? Does that make sense? It's almost like, could you imagine somebody who is a professor of applied mathematics, and it's one of those days in first grade, where you've got to bring your father to school. You've got to, what does your dad do? Right? And they've got to get up and explain, I'm a this, I'm a that. So this father is a professor of applied mathematics, and the kid is all excited. He's going to introduce his father, and he says, my father is so brilliant at maths, he can even do 10 plus 33 without his fingers. It's cute in school, but don't ever dare to introduce him that way in front of an audience when he's lecturing. Just because it's great in our world does not mean that defines Hashem's greatness. So, which name of Hashem would be the closest name we have to ever represent Hashem's greatness that actually can't be described? Which name does the best job? Not the name Aleph Dalet Nun Yud. Adonai is to describe his mastery over the universe. Which name? Okay, you say Elokeinu. Why? Why Elokeinu? So ours. If it's ours, then it's very much again back in our reality. Hashem's great because he's great for us. Whereas, what did you say? Not Chesed. Which name? The name Yud Kei Vav Kei, which we like to pronounce as Havaya. Why the name Yud Kei Vav Kei? Because it is the name that contains within it all the letters that you need for the past tense, the present tense, and the future tense in one word, which implies that which is beyond any definition. Because past, present, and future, the concept of time is the most defining reality. So this is beyond the defining reality. It's the best name we have. That's why it's called in many mystical texts Shem HaEtzem, the name that represents Hashem's essence. Okay? Al tistakel bakankan. Don't live your life. This is what Rabbi Meir is teaching us. Don't live your life only looking at the kankan, at the divine energy that is related to the universe, and now define your God by that greatness. Ela b'ma sheyesh bo. You have to look at what is in that kankan. Now let's read it slightly differently. Ela, rather, what should you focus on? You should focus on the ma, but shebesoichoi. The ma that is in it. Now, what is ma? Okay, that's kind of superfluous, right? What is ma? So, what is ma? Watch this. We have the name of Hashem, Yud, and Hey, and Vav, and Hey. Yes? Now, there's one of the methods that we use throughout Torah of trying to really understand the depth of a concept is called Miloi Asvan. It's a kind of Aramaic expression, which means spell the words out and it will give you greater insight into what the words are. So I'd like to ask you, how do you spell Yud? Yud, Vav, Dalet, yes? How do you spell Hey? Could be Hey Aleph, could be Hey Hey, could be Hey Yud. We'll go with Hey Aleph for now. Okay? How do you spell Vav? Could be Vav Vav, could be Vav Aleph Vav, could be Vav Yud Vav. Okay? We'll just go with Vav Vav. And we'll do the same over here with Hey. Count it all up and you will get to the numerical value 45. That's called the name called Ma. So sometimes people tell you about Hashem's 72-letter name. No 72-letter name, just put Yuds in instead of Alephs. And put a Yud between the Vavs, and you'll get the numerical value of 72. So depending on how exactly you spell it out, you have 4 options. It will either come to a total of 45, 52, 63, or 72. Okay? Those are all different manifestations of Hashem's name. What is Rabbi Meir teaching us? Al tistakel bakankan. Don't look at the whole world, the whole universe, just simply as a container of divine energy that is relative to the world. Ela, rather, bema, you should see the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, and specifically we won't go into why now in this particular manifestation. You should see Yud Kei Vav Kei, you should see that beyond the world, within the world, is the divine energy that is greater than the world can actually accommodate. And how do we access that? Obviously through Torah and mitzvahs. And that's really his message. Don't live bound by the parameters of the world. Live with the message of godliness that is within the world and accessible through Torah and mitzvahs. So just quickly, what's the numerical value? What's the gematria of Adonai? You can do this quickly. Okay, Aleph is 1, Dalet is 4, that gives us 5. Nun is 50, so that's 55. And a Yud is 10, so 65 plus 45 equals 100, which is the number of completion, which is the number of, not 100, 110, which is the number of Nes. Nes is 110. When you look for the deeper reality of the world, when you look for the godliness in the world that is actually greater than the world, which you can only access through the performance of Torah and mitzvahs, that's when you get to live a supernatural, super rational experience of life. Okay? It's quite a lot of information, but you thought Rabbi Meir was just saying give people the benefit of the doubt. He's obviously teaching us a lot more than that too.